Welcome to our today's fire chat, and we have a recurring visitor. You remember the rather successful fireside chats I had about a year ago with Jon Callas, who is a main figure in the privacy online privacy movement and as part of PGP. And he kindly agreed to come back to us on commenting on the recent findings that were, I think, released in a 2022 documentary. Was released, I think, on 22nd of April this year, where he was one of, I would call, the main witnesses to support the hypothesis that Satoshi Nakamoto was actually a duo of two relevant cypherpunks, Sassaman and Finney. As you might have seen or know, both of them have deceased and died for various different reasons, actually, more than 10 years ago. So evidently, they cannot make any statement on their own anymore. Welcome, Jon. And
Thank you very much.
yeah, so you played or you were cited essentially as one of the closest colleagues and friends of both of these figures. And so, can you maybe explain briefly to our audience, maybe also briefly to those who haven't watched the documentary, what you think and the movie, or maybe there's a distinction, I don't know, between what you think and what the movie proposed as having been behind the moniker Satoshi Nakamoto?
Yes. Um, the movie is Finding Satoshi. It was released 22nd of April 2026 onto streaming. I know that they are going to be putting it onto other streaming services and God only knows what else. Um, Nonetheless, the way that I got involved with it is that lots of people who are looking for Satoshi talk to me. And and part of that really boils down to I'm an old PGP person. I'm an old cypherpunk. I've been involved in a bunch of these things. I mean, I happened to be um, on the board of directors of the International Financial Cryptography Association when the Satoshi paper came out. And I am one of the moderators of Perry Metzger's cryptography list. So it was like I'm in the center of things with a lot of other people. It's like nearly anybody who goes looking for Satoshi is going to put me on their suspects list before they cross me off because, it's like I'm one of the people who happen to be around.
Yeah, and this, sorry to interrupt you, just for the audience, right? So the PGP was founded essentially in the 1990s. And why? And you were very close to Lance Sassaman and particularly also Hal Finney because they were both for various for various times employed, or you were friends with these two individuals. And
Yeah.
the cryptography mailing list you mentioned was the list where Satoshi Nakamoto essentially released the Bitcoin white paper on the 31st of October in, let's say, American time zone.
Hmm.
You want to comment a little bit on your particular relation with the two of them, how close you knew them, and from what kind of times you were kind of very close to them?
So I joined PGP, the company that there were two companies, and colloquially, those of us who were involved will refer to them as PGP1 and PGP2. But the first one was Pretty Good Privacy Incorporated, and Phil Zimmerman founded that with a number of other people in uh, late 95 or 96. I joined in January of 97. I started off as a security architect there. I was one of the people working on the key server. I became chief scientist and then later in the new one, chief technology officer, and that was a long time ago. Um, I mean, Hal is one of the people who's the original team PGP. So Hal was associated with PGP as part of Phil's first PGP1 going to PGP2 with a number of other people who departed from the scene there, including Peter Gutman was part of that, Branko Lancaster was part of that. And when the investigations against Phil got dropped and terminated, a bunch of people formed a company, and then I came in. Will Price, who is in there, was an utterly brilliant college student programmer. And he did a BBS system. He also did an encrypted container file system called CryptDisk. And I remember actually buying CryptDisk from Will when he was just doing it on his own, and even paying extra for the source. So Will was involved with that, and Will was one of the first people that got involved. And Will was vice president of engineering through a lot of it, and I was CTO. Olivia was our boss and ran all of engineering, technical support, customer support, etc. Len Sassaman worked for PGP. In part of the middle of that, he was a QA guy for a couple of years, but Len was also a member of a independent security think tank, as we call ourselves, called the Shmoo Group, which is another long discussion. The Shmoo Group ran a conference in Washington, D.C. that was a security conference for 20 years called ShmooCon. And I knew Len really well because he was a Shmoo. And I was close friends with Len. I was certainly, friends, colleagues, etc. with Hal. Hal worked remotely. He was in Santa Barbara. The rest of us were in Silicon Valley. It's a 4-ish hour drive. So he would come up a lot, but mostly he worked out of his house in Santa Barbara. And we worked together on a lot of things. I was the editor and one of the main authors of the PGP IETF documents, RFC 2440 and 4880. Large amounts of that, when it got down to brass tacks, was stuff that Hal wrote up for me, I edited, and then they are there. So there's some large sections of the PGP RFCs that even to this day are like 80 to 90% Hal's writing with clarifications, edits, and so on from other people. And so, yeah, I knew them really well. And I knew that Hal was interested in digital money. In between the two companies, I had a startup that I was working on with people that was a digital money system. Our goal was going to be that we were going to provide cheap international money transfers, compete with the likes of SWIFT and Western Union. We were going to do all of our development in Switzerland. Like many startups, it all fell apart, but lots of us were involved in this. And and it's
What
like
was the name of that? Do you like the name
it
of your?
it didn't really get far enough to have a name.
Okay.
It's like like many startups, it doesn't really have a name. So that there's my involvement was with PGP, with the people who were thinking about digital money. I'd done it myself, been to a lot of the things, and there were a lot of people like that. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is important to remember is that it wasn't like there were 2 or 3 people. There were lots of things. And when the Bitcoin paper came out, lots of people who looked at it said, "Oh, another one."
But wasn't there
And
like a hiatus between, let's say, developments in the let's say around the 1990s with also Chom and his DigiCash, and from my perspective, there hasn't been that intensity of developments in the years immediately preceding Bitcoin. It seemed to have a little bit stopped or slowed down significantly, let's say in the after the dot-com bubble imploded. in the early 2000s, right? Or is that I didn't see much of development except for some well, maybe the Adam Back kind of hash cache. I
Well,
think the latest update was in 2002, and then there were some established systems which were not decentralized, not really coming from the cypherpunk systems, like
Chown system is centralized.
yeah, but that was in the 90s,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's sorry,
I
that
mean,
might be okay.
after
I said they were not decentralized. There
yeah,
was some decentralized efforts. Some, I think, none of them really took it to the market, like with Nick Szabo and so on.
lots of people were
And
doing
the
it.
Wei
Lots of
Dai
people.
system, but as far as I know, they never went either
Yeah.
to becoming code, or if they became code, never passed the test stage, let's say. Right. So why was that gap between, let's say, the early 2000s and maybe the 5, 6 years until Satoshi Nakamoto launched the Bitcoin white paper in, as we said, end of October 2008?
The dot-com crash. I
Dot-com
mean,
crash. Yeah, that was.
the economy was very overheated in the late 1990s, and everybody thought that everything was going to be done on the internet, and they were one right and two too soon.
Yeah.
And that was where we had the dot-com recession of like 2000-ish or so. And one of the things that happened was that a lot of conferences like crypto in Santa Barbara, which is the main academic conference, its attendance went way down because all of the money went away. Is that there was an awful lot of money in the internet and money in cryptography in the dot-com boom, and that all went away when that recession happened, just like happens in recessions every time there is one. So I think that there's a several year drought in publicity, but the financial cryptography conference continued to go on, and it was certainly small. I mean, in the mid to late 2000s, it was 75 to 100 people, and and part of it was that there was a perception that the financial cryptography conference was a boondoggle. And the perception existed because it was. It was originally done, the first one was in 97, and it was originally done by um, Bob Hettinga and a couple of other people who lived in Boston because they wanted in February an excuse to go to someplace warm. So, so they said, why don't we do this conference about cryptography and money, and we'll do it outside the US in the Caribbean. And the government skeptical people also liked having it outside the US. And it was in fact very good for discussions to be off somewhere that wasn't the US, wasn't the EU, it was off somewhere else. And it was a good conference. It really was. I mean, it was good enough that I continued to go to it and even be one of the board of directors for it for a 2 or 3 year stint.
So you're talking about the finance. I mean, just for the audience, there's a conference called Crypto, which is kind of the main, I would say, academic
Mhm.
meeting. And then that was much older, right? That dates back
That
to the
started in the early
1980s.
80s, I think 81.
Yeah, yeah. So like a very
And
like and the other conference was the financial cryptography that was started by Vince Cate, I think, and Bob
Vince
Hettinga.
Cate and Bob Hettinga.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And then some others over the years kind of took over responsibilities and
yeah.
took like
Because
program chair
because
and so on.
it's a lot of work to run a
Yeah,
conference,
yeah,
and
yeah,
ultimately neither one of them wanted a second job running a conference.
yeah, yeah. And but I tried to track down the all the programs, like of these conferences, and I was quite surprised that the topic of Bitcoin was only appearing like like I think in 2012 or so, if I recall correctly, right? So why
Yeah.
would that kind of conference not have jumped on the Bitcoin bandwagon much earlier? Because I think the rumors were already
So,
spreading in whatever 2009, 2010 or so.
so, here's where I think we'll pull it forward to the Finding Satoshi movie.
Okay.
And and so I'm going to put that onto the stack for just a moment because lots of people are looking for Satoshi come and they talk to me. And and you're one of them, and I'm happy to talk to them. And and Tyler Maroney, who was in the film and the main investigator for it, got an introduction to me via my old boss at the ACLU. And Tyler was also someone who did the investigation for a podcast slash situation here in the US where there was a case where in Baltimore a young woman was murdered and her boyfriend Adnan Syed was convicted of it, and they did this podcast where they looked for him, and Tyler was the main investigator for that. Um, it's kind of interesting because when Tyler and I were talking about this, one of the things that he said to me, and I don't remember which conversation we had this, but we talked about it, and he said that he didn't know who committed the murder. He went and he was an investigator. He's an investigator and an investigative reporter, a private eye and an investigator. And he said that he went and investigated and uncovered a whole bunch of prosecutorial misconduct. And that the prosecutorial misconduct that he uncovered led to the conviction being reversed. But he says, I have no idea who actually did it. And this is relevant to us because I think that one of the strengths of the movie and Tyler's investigation and everything else that they did was that Tyler is a really good investigator. That he and I would talk and we would talk about things and I would sometimes joke and he says, who do you think did it? And my answer was, oh, I think Nicholas Bourbaki did it. And he said, huh? And then I said, that's kind of a joke because there was in the mid 20th century, there was a mathematical series of papers all written by Nicholas Bourbaki. And then it became known that Nicholas Bourbaki was actually a group of people. And today we refer to them as the Bourbaki group. And so what I really mean is I think a group of people did it. I think that you need to think of Satoshi Nakamoto more like the name of a rock band than a person.
Yeah, I just think like when you talk about the groups, like I mean, it's not just a random group. It's not just like, look, I wrote a lot of scientific papers, right? And sometimes you have like people who you met at a conference and had a whatever, just technical discussion over a beer, and then you kind of co-author a paper. I think that's particularly common also with computer science and so on, where you can remotely kind of associate. But why I pointed at the financial cryptography is I think for the secrecy, the extreme secrecy that kind of persists until nowadays. So essentially, like they probably had, like whoever Satoshi was, must have started programming it in 2007. That's also what he stated himself, and I think it's quite credible that it probably was a
Mhm.
year or two of more or less intensive work on it, to come up. And so why I diverged there a little bit and the financial cryptography is that I thought, okay, that would have been an environment where disjunct people would have met over a beer. I think there was also, as far as I heard, I didn't participate myself, some pretty good social program and some, let's say, fun elements, and I thought, okay, like if it's called financial cryptography, though that was maybe the most relevant, like if you just look at the title, most relevant conference for originating such a project like Bitcoin. There was also like Peter Thiel, the what's called the who has this famous Silicon Valley investor, um, who who said that Satoshi Nakamoto was probably at Bitcoin, and not at Bitcoin, at Financial Cryptography 2000 in Anguilla, I think. So that a lot of trails, at least if you take that serious, so that's why. So what is the environment you think that such a group could have formed and sealed a pact of eternal, if you will, confidentiality,
Because
right?
everyone
That
was doing everyone was doing this. That's what the whole scene was. It's kind of like saying, a bunch of people were going out to nightclubs and they were all dressed in black. And it's like, yeah, they were all dressed in black.
okay.
It was the style, it was what people did. And also, one of the things that I said to Tyler early on was history looks different when you look at it backwards than when you look at it forwards. That even major worldwide events get taught in this way where you look back on history and act as if it is inevitable, but it isn't. I mean, historians today can look at World War II and they say, oh, it is inevitable that things would come out. But at the time, it sure didn't feel that way. And and similarly, I will say that lots of people were talking about how to do things with digital money, how to do things with it. I mean, it's like um, the startup that I was doing would have used Xiaomi and Cash, and 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 we would have done it that way because for the sorts of things that we were doing, we thought that was the correct way to do it. Um, and how you build distributed consensus systems is difficult, and we're going to get into a discussion of what's wrong with modern cryptocurrency as opposed to who is Satoshi if I continue on this. But I think it's important to say that there were a lot of people who were thinking about all sorts of stuff like this. And there were discussions going on about this, that, the other thing, including proof of work. Um, I once had a conversation with Hal over lunch, and we were talking about a whole bunch of things because before Bitcoin, one of the things that Hal had done was buy used out of the dot-com crash a bunch of secure processors, the IBM coprocessor board. If I remember it correctly, it's 4758, but I'm getting old. Um, and he had bought a bunch of these and he was going to be using them as essentially secure enclaves or, trusted execution environments is what we call them today to do managing digital money. And we were talking about things and he was asking me, what do you think about proof of work? I've been doing some thinking about it, da, 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 da. And I unloaded because I think proof of work is just beyond stupid. And years later, I realized that in that lunch conversation, I failed the interview to be part of Satoshi Nakamoto. Because it's like looking back on it myself, I can see that this is Hal saying, it's like we're doing this thing over here. Do and it's like, let me feel out whether or not you want to be part of it. And when I basically said, oh my God, this is horrible, it's like we moved on.
I mean, like also in my book, right? Just touching base with what you just said, right? I mean, like I talked to a couple of other either Satoshi researchers or even former and or even present day cypherpunks, if you will, and they said that the 2005 presentation by Hal at the CodeCon, actually, it was more like a demo, might
Mhm.
have been a key moment. And so that would either say that Hal was part of Satoshi Nakamoto, or at least that he inspired, but possibly
Yeah.
not knowing that he did. Maybe other participants at this, what is, I think it was mostly like a cypherpunk meeting, right? These
It was
CodeCon
it was
conferences that Len actually organized
yeah.
with, I think, Bram
Len
Cohen.
Len with Len and Bram
Yeah,
did it, but it was mostly
yeah.
Len.
So
And
when,
and
so
and
yeah.
and code yeah, there were several code cons. I mean, I spoke at one of them myself.
Okay,
And
um, so when I guess when you had this discussion with Hal, that must have been around the time when he was working on this RPow, which was based on essentially this processor that you just mentioned.
I
Did
think
the topic of I mean, that was not really decentralized, right? It was
no,
essentially
no, it
Bitcoin
wasn't.
without decentralization a little bit in that direction.
Yeah.
What was
Um,
everybody like talking at in the mid 2000s or around 2005 really about this essential ingredient of being able to decentralize? Was that kind of the main challenge that nobody could figure out?
I
Or
think
what
nobody
was it? Was
cared.
it different
I think
direction?
nobody cared. It really is nobody cared.
About decentralization
Yeah.
or yeah.
Yes. Because the modality that we were all thinking of was money sits in banks, money sits in vaults. And and certainly people were talking about how you could do things because if you go and you look at what Stuart Haber did with his time stamping system, which Bitcoin is in many ways splices together Haber's time stamping system along with RPow and a couple of other things, and you throw it together and you end up with this.
Yeah, just for the audience, sorry to interrupt you. So essentially 3.5 citations of the 8 citations only that were part of Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin white paper were essentially directly and one indirectly referring to Stuart Haber
Yeah.
and his colleagues' work on timestamping that were published essentially in the first half of the 1990s, or the foundations
Mhm.
at least were set, right? So sorry to
Yep.
interrupt you there, just to clarify it for the audience.
Yep. So um people didn't people it people lots of people were doing this, and lots of people were were doing things, and then something comes in to change what's going on. And we see this sort of thing in other cultural phenomenons throughout history, where you will get something like, oh, in Renaissance English theater, Christopher Marlowe sweeps in and in one play invents both blank verse and iambic pentameter, and now everything has changed. That you have an entire early rock and roll scene where lots of people are doing this, that, and the other thing, and then bam, the Beatles swoop in and turn it into a worldwide phenomenon. And similarly, it took people to while to figure out about Bitcoin. And I think that the real thing is they actually turned it on. That what made it different, what makes Bitcoin different is that it is not the papers, it's that they turned it on and they actually started doing stuff with it.
But I
So,
mean, like what, like I still, maybe that's at least my angle at it. Like the central innovation of Bitcoin was how to decentralize, right? I mean, that
and
was essentially one of maybe the most important or one of the most important things
and
that
I'm
were
going to say that that is part of why it got ignored. It was so innovative that people didn't, until it was turned on, it was yeah, this is kind of interesting, but would that really work? And is that really the way that we want to design things? And is da 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 da. Uh, Again, history looks different when you're looking when you go through it forwards than when you look at it backwards. Because when you look at it backwards, it's obvious where things are going. But when you're living through it, it is not obvious.
yeah. Now, if we jump back to the finding Satoshi and the tandem, right? So, I mean, the scene, as you said, probably didn't care about decentralization or didn't believe in it. But I mean, as you were very close to the two of the proposed members of Satoshi Nakamoto, did you ever get the impression that they were heading towards decentralization?
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, like, I'm not an expert, as my viewers know, on cryptography, right? But um, I think Satoshi Nakamoto, just to come up with this rather complex, from my angle, ingenious idea of coupling the issuance of the new money, Bitcoin, to essentially a proof of work that would be a competition across essentially everybody who wants to participate,
Yeah.
right? You must
And
have mulled like endlessly how to piece it all together in order to get the right kind of like the right
it really boils down to we
mixture
turned it
of
on. It
things,
wasn't
right?
just a paper. So
Go ahead.
talking about a bunch of this, Len was a really good friend of mine. And a thing to remember about Len. Okay, so I'm going to pop back a bit. One of the things that you stated, particularly when we were setting this up, was that you described the hypothesis as um, um, Finney plus Sassaman equals Satoshi. And I almost wrote back and didn't, only because I would have to go in and find the right mathematical characters in Unicode, was that no, Hal is a subset of Satoshi, or Hal is a member of the set, and Len is a member of the set. But I firmly believe that there are unknown, even still, people. Hal was obviously in it to his eyeballs. There was a time when Hal said, "Oh, all I did was I gave them my elliptic curve code," and that was certainly the case. Hal had some elliptic curve code, and an agreement between us as his employers, as we do with a whole bunch of people, was that we would license the software for our own use in an unlimited way, which really meant we take your software, we can do anything we want with it, but you can also continue to go do anything you want to it, because an unlimited license to use and ownership are really close when it comes to things like software.
But when you say them, do you mean like Hal Finney knew that his code would enter what later become Bitcoin, or did he just, like if I write a paper in my own scientific topic, like in a journal or something, release it or send it to a colleague
Oh,
for
Hal
like
said that
like
he gave Satoshi.
so that means he knew who Satoshi was, or he wasn't as a civil identity,
You're ask,
or
you're asking me detailed questions about casual conversations that happened, close to 20 years ago.
okay,
So
so you just
so
don't remember. Yeah, yeah, okay.
yeah,
Well, that's fair enough. I'm just
it
asking.
yeah. Uh, so it and I think that part of a larger point here is, in fact, that there's all sorts of things where there are no notes and no records because none of us thought to. you know, it's like there are the mailing list. There was the
Yeah.
cypherpunks mailing list that went on for a while. There was this, there was that. People talked about stuff that lots of people are known either primarily or just about only as a pseudonym or a handle. Um, um, it's like, for example, the startup that I did that fell apart was along with Black Unicorn, and very few people know who Black Unicorn is. And
Okay.
there was a while when figuring out who the real person that Black Unicorn was sort of a game that went on.
Yeah. I mean, just to make a point here, right? Just because people watching my channel, all of them, or a lot of them would be communicating or just reading my book, and so what I sense, and that might be a little bit finicky or so, but the documentary, right, as far as I understand it, said that Satoshi Nakamoto was only, I'm not sure whether they explicitly said that, but the impression is conveyed that Satoshi Nakamoto was essentially a team only made of Len Sassaman and Hal Finney, and that they either or one of them, they were consciously involved, so they're kind of not like just that somebody wrote the code and the other one took it without his knowledge, right? And that essentially Hal Finney wrote the code, and Len Sassaman was more like a spokesperson.
So
So is that what some?
where we get into the disagreements of lots of people's personal beliefs. Um, um, because I am willing to believe that Len was involved, but I also know that Len, who was a reasonably close friend of mine, he was an anonymity person. He was the maintainer slash developer of an anonymous remailer called Mixmaster. He was very much into this sort of thing. Also, Len was one of these people who is very black and white in his beliefs, and he had a lot of very strong opinions about things. Um, I think that Len's involvement was minimal because Len would never have used the word anonymity the way that it is used in the paper. And that is a thing that is one of his peeves. He was also someone who was he never graduated from high school, but he was in a doctoral program at KU Leuven with Bart Pernille and others on anonymity technologies. And he was very, very, very adamant and had extraordinarily strong opinions. So I think that whatever involvement Len had with it, and my initial reaction is don't be ridiculous. I remember being at a DEF CON ninja party, in the middle of the desert out near Las Vegas, and it was run by people, beer is flowing, there are bands playing loud music, and we're both slagging Bitcoin and thinking that, and saying this is really stupid. Um, I I don't believe that Len would have been that involved. Will believes Len was absolutely up to his eyeballs. Will, who was VP of engineering and Hal's manager, um, thinks that the Bitcoin code Hal could have written it. I think that the Bitcoin code is radically different than what I saw Hal writing a lot of. And so this is one of these things where Will and I disagree on that. It's like I look at the Bitcoin code that if you think of a scale as to like, what's evidence for or against, I think that the Bitcoin code is evidence against Hal's central involvement, whereas Will thinks it is evidence for.
Just let me clarify. Like, I mean, there was an email that most people that look into the Satoshi Nakamoto story plays a major role, and that was like Hal Finney, I think it was in 2013 or something, came out and told the community about his fatal disease, right?
Mhm.
And he said, "I'm not Satoshi," and he said he admired the code very much, right? As opposed to many others who kind of
Mhm.
slagged it. And he said, I'm a C programmer, I'm not a C++ programmer. That was the language that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote the Bitcoin code in. And the other thing is, I think I also sense that from your end, one major criticism of Bitcoin is its lack of anonymity, at least in the cypherpunk interpretation, right? And see, and you just mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that this was a major pain point for Len Sassaman. He was so much, maybe even extreme in a cypherpunk sense, on anonymity that he would have never. I mean, I always say like Bitcoin is a compromise, so kind of like Satoshi, more or less, if you read it between the lines, intentionally sacrificed anonymity for the sake of decentralization, right? He
Yep.
said he would love to make it more anonymous, but like say, but he somehow wanted to publish it and couldn't figure it out. There were a couple of people suggesting some hacks how to make it more anonymous, but
If you look at
I,
both Zcash and Monero, both Zcash and Monero are the sorts of things that I would expect to come from someone like Len
yeah,
as opposed to
yeah,
Bitcoin.
yeah, that's pretty
So,
much, yeah,
so there was a time when I drove down when Hal was absolutely confined to a wheelchair. I drove down to Santa Barbara with Phil Zimmerman, and we spent time with Hal there. And I flat out asked Hal if he was Satoshi, and he denied it. At the time, I took his denial as a non-denial denial. And there was a time when I thought that Hal was Satoshi. And actually, it's part of the investigations going here that convinced me that no, actually, I'm firmly convinced that while he was definitely involved, he wasn't there. And I still really think that asking who's Satoshi is like asking which one's Pink. Who is Pink Floyd? Well, nobody is Pink Floyd. And one of the things that Fran says, and it's delightful that Fran finally agreed to talk, and Fran talks in that movie. And one of the things that Fran has said is that Hal told her flat out he's not Satoshi. And she pounds her fist on the table, at least she did to me, and said, Hal would never lie to me. And I'm willing to believe that Hal would never lie to her. And Hal was extraordinarily involved. And part of the way that I think about it in my rock band metaphor is that Hal wrote an awful lot of the early lyrics of the Satoshi Nakamoto band. He played bass for the Satoshi Nakamoto band. But there was also somebody who's lead guitarist and singer, and that is the person whom we are missing. And I believe that we have no idea who that person was. I'm willing to believe that Len was involved early. I believe that Len left the band over creative differences because, Len would have been okay with saying in the paper that that Bitcoin was pseudonymous as opposed to anonymous. And all Satoshi would have had to have done to get Len continued to be involved was to say pseudonymous rather than anonymous. And I believe that this is one of those creative difference things where on this side someone says, no, I don't want to say that. I really want to say that it's anonymous. Come on, what do you mean? Nobody knows who a wallet address is. That's anonymous. And the other side says, don't you understand? It can be tracked down and triangulated. Once this person spends money with several other people, you can figure out pretty much who they are. It's not anonymous at all. You're going to get people in trouble. Len would have said something like, you're going to get people killed by calling it anonymous. Because that's the
and
sort of
yeah, so
dramatic statement Len would have said.
from what you just said, you essentially imply that Satoshi Nakamoto was more than Hal Finney and Len Sassaman. Len Sassaman might have been a temporary member
Mhm.
who maybe disengaged at some stage.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Left the band over creative differences. Might have been at
okay,
one or
I
two of the
mean,
first concerts, but he wasn't there. He wasn't there for the album release.
okay,
Where,
any assumptions who could have been
no,
another member? Or, okay,
no,
because I
and
mean, the strange thing is, at least, I mean, we jump a little bit between the movie and let's say your own, let's say, refined um, opinion on the Satoshi Nakamoto story. So because the what struck me in the movie is like if you take the tandem, just sure now with just the pure hypothesis of the movie, right? They called Sassaman a spokesperson, And then on the other hand, Fran and Hell actually himself said that he mined a little bit in 2009 for a couple of weeks or months and had a little stash that, from what I hear, was essentially spent after his death on whatever medical cost or just leaving it to his wife or whatever. It doesn't really matter so much. But he was not the owner of the approximately 1 million Bitcoin that is typically linked to Satoshi Nakamoto's stash,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I refer to that as the Satoshi tranche.
Yeah, or the
And
Patoshis or so. Depend. There's different names. Okay, so but
but
then
but but
yeah,
you know, I believe that the key, meaning the wallet, for the Satoshi tranche was lost when
yeah,
they
but
fired it up.
yeah, but I
I
did
think the
like
reason
I
why
spend a
we've
lot of
never heard
time
anything
on.
from it,
Sorry. I spend a lot of
I think they
time on
lost it.
analyzing. I mean, it's actually against also the statement of the movie, right? We said the coins, except for some very early kind of more like test transactions, were never moved. This is actually not true. I mean, I mean, the good thing about the blockchain is that every transaction is registered, and we know that Satoshi moved
So
the coins. And actually, I mean, it's kind of a
no, there's
statistical
the first
analysis.
Satoshi tranche, and it's never been touched.
Oh, it has been, right? That's just a statement that is always repeated in hearsay, but you can really see on the blockchain that they were moved in 2010. Not much, it's not like any major parts of them. It's just like a few hundred or so, if I read. So something that was worth at the time a few $100s, a maximum. So
Yeah,
nothing, let's say, super impactful or so. No,
right.
Satoshi wouldn't have.
And the last time that I visited Hal, because I think this is relevant and it cuts to the the history observation that I make, is that Hal had finally been forced permanently into a motorized wheelchair, which, is kind of like, merely calling it a wheelchair because he had eye tracking on it. He had large screen TVs that he had bought and so on. And the Christmas before that, he used Bitcoins, which were then worth about $2 a coin. He bought cashmere socks for his whole family, and the cashmere socks that he bought were about 20 Bitcoin per pair. He bought a large screen TV that was like, $1,000 or so large screen TV, which would have been about 500 Bitcoins. It's like you got to remember that in those days, the attitude that people had was, I'll just mine more. That Bitcoin was created as a money transfer system. It was the same thing that other people were doing when they were doing things. It was, they wanted to make a payment system, not to build a speculative investment thing. And even in Bitcoin itself, um, the argument is made that the increase in value of Bitcoins and so on is there as a way to cover the costs of the miners. That there is this idea that seems naive at the time, where you say it couldn't have been that way, was that the argument of how does this network pay for itself? How do you just pay for the electricity? And the answer is, oh, the money that comes from mining and Bitcoin, that's just all there to pay for the system.
Yeah. Well,
And that
there's.
was a hand wave that Bitcoin proponents did
Yeah.
in the early days. But with the movie itself, in a conversation that I had just the other day, like, this week with Tyler and Will, one of the things that Will said, because one of the, it's important to remember that Will's father was Frank Price, who was the lead executive of Universal Studios in the 1980s. He comes from a filmmaking family. Will really cares about the movie as a movie because he comes from a movie making family. Um, And he said, I'd really like to have the 10-hour director's cut because there's so much lost in this in this hour and a half thing. And and if you look at the movie as an artifact, the movie has to say something. And the movie has to also compress hundreds of hours because there's all sorts of talk with me. I spent a couple of days with them early on. There were the things where Will and Olivia and I um, all met with the filmmakers in Los Angeles and we did things. There's lots and lots of hours that are just not there. And the filmmakers have to edit it down to a a small thing, which means that information is going to be lost. And they also have to have a story and a reason why someone is going to watch this. Nonetheless, one of the things that I had mentioned to Tyler, and he said, "Oh, I think I'm going to steal with it," is that I really like that, at least from my viewpoint, there is no Agatha Christie ending. There is no, the detective walks out and says, like Poirot or Benoit Blanc, here's what went on and here's where all of the evidence is that Tyler, who is the investigator, who his strength is how dispassionate he is. He turns up a whole bunch of facts, and then people need to interpret the facts. And Tyler says, I'm not going to interpret the facts. I'm just giving you the facts. That
Yeah.
I like that there is no Agatha Christie ending. And certainly, and a lot of us have still debate about it. I mean, it's like I think Hal was involved enough that on the one hand, he was definitely involved. You can see from like Alyssa Blackburn's analyses of blockchain transactions that he was involved, but there's also in there evidence that he wasn't Satoshi because there's transactions that went on while he was known to be running a marathon. And this is evidence on that side of the scale. So, so they have to come up with a coherent narrative, and lots of us disagree. I mean, Will and I disagree on a number of things, which are in some respects piddling, because Will says, "Oh yeah, I think Hal was involved." I and a bunch of other people say Hal wrote C++ like a C programmer, and this is in fact one of the things that uh, Rob, I'm forgetting his last name, but Malware Rob, um, he said after the New York Times article came out and said, I've looked at both Adam Back's code and the Bitcoin code, and the Bitcoin code was written by somebody who is a Microsoft MFC C++ programmer. You can see that it's just written that way, and that's not how Adam Back writes. And to me, someone who worked with Hal on the low end of other things, I also look at that and say that's a Windows programmer. Hal wasn't a Windows
Yeah.
programmer.
The whole
Will
setup is
says, "Oh no,
essentially,
oh no, oh no,
yeah,
I disagree. Hal could have done that." And so, gentle persons can agree to disagree on things. We still have our conversations,
yeah. Well,
but
I just like when you praise the investigator, right? I'm a scientist, right? That's the thing I approached, and a basic thing you want to avoid methodologically, and I know it's boring, but in science you do that, right? Is to go into contradictions, right? Any hypothesis, that's a basic principle of logic that you can lead to a contradiction proves the hypothesis completely false, right? You would never like accept contradictions in a hypothesis. You would have to dismiss it unless you find an explanation how to resolve it. Maybe you were missing some information or something you got wrong or so.
okay.
And like I think the other thing you want to avoid in a scientific one, and I understand you explained it really well, that a movie has a different objective than, let's say, the stuff I do, because the movies are
Hmm.
watched by 1,000 times more people than my with endless writing in a book that you can hardly read from cover to cover, right? But that's a sacrifice I'm making. But I mean the second, so I think there's like if you start the movie with the hypothesis that Satoshi never moved his coins. This is absolutely wrong because you can scientifically prove it on the blockchain that he did, and most likely, and it's not only me who came to these conclusions, there's some other people on X and so on who looked at the various transactions. And one thing that would refer to the movie and also what you just said is there's a difference between Satoshi Nakamoto moving, let's say, during the Satoshi era, so until 2010. Bitcoin wasn't really worth much, right? It was, let's say, more or less like order of magnitude $1 per Bitcoin at the peak. So somebody famously moved, I think, in May 2010. So that's pretty much now, almost exactly whatever, 16 years ago. Bought, I think, one or two pizzas, delivery pizzas for, I think, 20,000 Bitcoin, right? It was absolutely ridiculous in the current, in today's value, right? So that's about when you mined a little bit, that would actually, as you said, just cover your electricity bill, more or less, right? But the other thing is Satoshi did speculate. So I'm talking about the messages he sent on the Bitcoin forum or to his peers in emails that we're aware of, right? He did speculate on the value increase. And if you look at it just by the halving, the whole math, and I'm not going to go into the details, essentially requires for a kind of a viable Bitcoin that the value must increase at the pace of the halvings. Let's put it in simple words,
Sure.
right? The second thing is like
Sure.
there's some other,
Bitcoin people always, would always said that
well,
because
that's a wishful
one of the
thinking.
arguments against
Yeah.
Bitcoin was always that the halvings are a flaw.
Yeah, but it's in the design. I think nobody's going to change that. And that requires essentially that I simplified it. I mean, it's a bit more nuanced, but if the value of Bitcoin wasn't increasing, you would either risk that the decentralization is compromised in terms of somebody could take over Bitcoin, or the transaction fees would write into spheres that a Bitcoin transaction would be more expensive than a Western Union transaction between different countries, right? But let's not get
And
too
that
much
is
in.
that is that the, both of those are failures that we have seen in cryptocurrencies. And 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 there is that while Bitcoin's made a lot of people a lot of money, you know. It's but as a intellectual endeavor, Bitcoin failed on every one of its goals. It's not anonymous. It's not cheaper. It only scales a little bit. It doesn't scale enough for it to meet its goals, which I look at this only as saying Bitcoin was a version 1 product that told us how good version 3 has been or how good version 3 would be. And we're today nowhere near getting version 3, but it suggests how you could build something. But Bitcoin is a proof of concept of how to build digital money. And and everybody involved in it has learned a lot in it. But it was an early thing that just, it is an issue with Bitcoin that it is extraordinarily hard to upgrade it into a better system.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Okay.
brilliant, but it's a V1 system.
I think like I leave that uncommented, but of course this is a matter of fierce discussion. Your opinion, if you go to the Bitcoin conference, right, you would probably see a lot of believers and
Yeah,
enthusiasts that are completely the opposite. And I'm not going to take a stance here because I just look at the history. But let's get back to the
yeah,
movie, right? The other
yeah.
thing
Well,
is
yeah.
the movie has.
Let's get back to it. Where I really think that the people who were involved in it were people who did not ever meet physically. They very likely knew each other by handles. Um, and they put the thing together and they turned it on and it worked. I mean, that's an amazing achievement.
Yeah. But
Um,
but who
I
has the
think that
coins? They were
um,
not burned because you see that at least until 2011, so I would say even past Len Sassaman's unfortunate suicide, the coins were moved, and there's a lot of patterns you can analyze. Again, stochastically, there's no clear proof because Bitcoin doesn't have a name tag against these transactions, but you see certain patterns where statistical analysis tells you that the coins were even moved past Finney's own death in, I think, August 2014, right? I mean, the chances, the probability that they're still associated with Satoshi Nakamoto decreases, of course, with the number of transactions. But
sure.
I've had this
Right now,
chapter,
right
yeah,
now, you could consider Satoshi Nakamoto to be whoever has access to certain cryptographic keys. Um, we get on the cryptography mailing list, which is a moderated list. We get people who say, I'm Satoshi, I'm back, a handful of times a year. You know, every so often somebody creates a Satoshi Nakamoto 12345 at blah, blah, blah domain, and they say, I'm Satoshi, I'm back. And a couple of weeks ago, one came in and I just replied back, prove it. And I have on other occasions said more than that. Because if you really are Satoshi and you really do want to say, I'm Satoshi, there are a couple of ways that you could do it and nobody would argue with it. One would be that you would send a message sent with the Satoshi PGP key. If you sent a message signed with the Satoshi PGP key, um, um, that would show to that you well, you know, it shows that you're pretty close to Satoshi Nakamoto. Um, if you did something like you went over to known Satoshi owned tranches of coins and did something like said, okay, I'm going to move some amount of money from one wallet and then back. Tell me what number. How many should I do? I'll do that. And if somebody said, okay, I'll move 3 Bitcoins here and back. Well, how many? Give me another number. Give me a number between 1 and 10. I'll move that many Bitcoins back and forth, and I'll do it like half a dozen times. This is actually a form of zero knowledge proof. You know, it's like I can prove that I'm Satoshi by you tell me how many Bitcoins you want, and I move them and move them back. You give me another number and move them back. If we do that a few times, then that's a zero knowledge proof that you're Satoshi.
well, he could essentially just sign a message with pretty much zero Bitcoin on the
Yeah.
blockchain or off the blockchain. I mean, but I mean, that would, I think quite firmly, either the person behind or the persons behind the moniker never want to come out. So it's not like somebody wants to be found, right? It's more like they don't want to be found, or they're in
Yes.
for a very long haul kind of objective of taking over the
Yes.
world or crashing the entire system out of some intention, you know?
Yes.
So I don't think like I would be very skeptical if somebody calls himself Satoshi Nakamoto. I would, especially in my research, I contacted a few people, you know, and the least thing I would like, if you read my book, you have a couple of people that I profiled, which I contacted, and I think it has to be one of them.
Mhm.
And I'm actually not really interested in doxing the person behind the moniker or the persons. I just want to see, you know, I just want to show up that there are more people who could have been involved. Maybe a little bit
And
what you said that it
and
wasn't really,
I believe there are between 1 and 3, almost certainly not 3. I really believe at most 2 other people who are involved who have gone to ground and we don't know what they did. Because if you were someone who had squirreled away Bitcoin because it's like there was a time when Bitcoins are like gum wrappers. You know, it's like you find them in your clothing days later. I know somebody Well, I know of somebody. I don't know somebody, but there was somebody that mentioned casually to me that they had been given a Bitcoin by somebody when they were an undergraduate in a bar. And it was a young woman who said that, this guy gave me this thing and I found the Bitcoin in the bottom of my old purse. And now I've got a bunch of money that I'm just spending on fun stuff. And this was a thing that I heard recently. It's like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hal was spending them. There, lots of people were mining coins and spending them. I have a friend who's trans, and she paid for her top surgery with mined Bitcoins. She has the most expensive rack that any human has ever had. I know somebody else that paid for their master's degree. They paid the tuition for their MBA with mined Bitcoins. And so they have an extraordinarily expensive degree if you look at it that way. And none of these people have any regrets on it. And
But
this
we
goes
are
back to
talking,
my history looks different from one direction or another. It's
but we,
similar to people who had like, early Cisco stock. And, and they spent it to do things. This is always when you're in a startup. It's like, when do you hold on to it and when do you sell it? So I think that there is at least one other person. And one of the things that I had said to Tyler when he was talking about it was, who else could it be? Because I think that most of the people looking for Satoshi are looking for the lost car keys under the streetlight, that they're not looking in the dark. And I'm not saying this as an insult because it's extraordinarily hard to look in the dark because there's no light there. And I kind of jokingly said, how about an extropian to be named later? And part of the reason that I said an extropian when I was talking to him was I know that Hal was an extropian. I was never involved in them, but I was tangent to them. I knew extropians. I saw some of their magazines. I know that Hal published a bunch of his cryptographic stuff in the extropian magazines. Um, Very smart people. Any one of those people could have gone off and done it because by the time 2008 rolled around, you didn't need to be an algorithms expert in elliptic curve cryptography or hash functions or anything because there are already a bunch of libraries around. As Hal originally said was he gave Satoshi his elliptic curve code. So I think that somebody did it, and I think that the extropian movement is a good direction to go there. I mean, for Pete's sake, Ralph Merkle was an extropian, and certainly Ralph Merkle could have been it. I mean, almost certainly he wasn't because Ralph left the cryptography world and closed the door and locked it behind him. It's like he went off to go do other things. But certainly he could have if he wanted to. And at this point, there would be enough smart people with enough programming skills in that community. There could have been, one step removed where a bunch of people mentioned it to other people. I mean, who knows? Because there are all of these personal connections that are going on in various subcultures of the cypherpunk, etc. community because it had its own subcultures. I mean, the whole anonymity mixmaster world that Len was at was its own subculture and today even still is. So I really think that there is somebody else. I have no idea who it was.
but I mean, just coming back to the value, right? There's a difference, let's say, between the value of Bitcoin in the Satoshi era, so roughly from uh, 2009 to 2010 mostly, and maybe like
Yep,
like Satoshi exited mostly in eventually in 2011, like in I think April, end of April 2011, right? At that
yep.
time, if he had cashed in all his BTC, that wouldn't have been a life-changing amount of money. But let's say if Len or no, if that was a time when of Sassaman's passing, right? Okay, if we look at the time when Finney passed, the Bitcoin did whatever, I think something like 10, order of magnitude 10 Bitcoin or more, right? So if you have 1 million Bitcoin, that would be order of magnitude, I don't know exact rate, something like $10 million. And there was already a market. There were the first kind of big shots, like the Winklevoss twins and so on. They were already on board, right? So there would have been a market to probably at least gradually cash in, right? So if you were in your
I
final stages, I think in the American system, it's not that cheap to be seriously ill, right? And so at that stage, to throw away something like several million dollars, I'm not sure whether, about the assets that Hal Finney had, and probably that's private. But for a lot of people like me, something north of $1 million would be hard to just scrap, right? Especially if you have a family, and I think Hal had also kids, right? That survive you. Kind of, he knew, of course, that he wouldn't last forever with that
Yeah,
disease,
I
right?
mean,
So,
well, with ALS, one of the things about ALS is that because it is a nerve degeneration, you basically choose when it is that you're going to die because there is the and a thing that Hal told me was that he he referred to his condition as his enforced early retirement. And Hal's somebody who had a great life of mind, and he was saying, I'm actually enjoying this. I get to watch all the movies I want to watch, and get to do these other things. It's like I read mailing lists slowly because he had to use an eye tracker, but he's saying now, Fran, on the other hand, Fran was a very physical person, and Fran would have been driven bats by losing control of her body in the way that Hal did not. And this is one of the things about ALS people is that eventually it goes into the so how much more do you want to do this? Um, I'm not really sure I want to talk about Len this way. I mean, Len was a very close friend. And Meredith was a very close friend. And Len and Meredith met at CodeCon, and they were head over heels in love with each other. Absolutely, just like they became a social unit, and it was always Len and Meredith. And one of the things that Meredith has said is Len never told her anything about it. So to me, when you evaluate what's going on, part of why I am skeptical of a lot of discussion of Len's involvement is that I don't believe that Len could have been Satoshi and and lived with himself and he would have told Meredith. So I am willing to believe, and one of the, when I've talked to Will about this, I've said that I think that Len's involvement was here. You think Len's involvement is there, and actually, my y-axis is reversed. But I also think that there's daylight in there where we are also in violent agreement. Len could have been involved, and an event that happened that I keep thinking about was in fact that when Len died, there was a memorial for him, and a bunch of people put stuff on. They put an ASCII art picture or something on the blockchain. And at the time, there were a whole bunch of people that said, this is really, this is weird and in fact kind of creepy because Len hated Bitcoin. But on the other hand, what if they knew something that we didn't know? What if there were a bunch of people who knew that Len had been involved for a time, but was not centrally involved? So I think that there's an awful lot of daylight between my looking at the situation because I knew Len and other people looking at it. And it's like, it's not like I know, it's not, and it's also not like I've spent a lot of time digging into this either. Um, so I really do think that when I look at the negative space around Satoshi, it's like there's a black thing and there's a background of it. That if you try to fill in the Satoshi picture with just Len and just Hal, it doesn't cover Satoshi. There's still black space left. There's still things there. There is, to me, definitely, it can't be just the two of them.
I mean, like like I'm talking to different people or reading up stuff, and I'm not sure whether it was mentioned in the movie, but there's like let's say a research and how secrets are kept. Most of that is in the context of crime, right? Like if you have three bank robbers, and one of them starts squealing, and so, but it's, let's say, to put it down, the more members of a potential team Satoshi you add, the more the more degrees of freedom you have to match the criteria that apply to Satoshi Nakamoto. It's much easier, right? If you add endless people, you can whatever cover stylometry, coding, and all that. The only big problem you have is secrecy, right? Everybody knows the more people share a secret,
Yeah,
the more
this is
likely, the more leaky it
there
gets.
is there is a Ben Franklin aphorism, which is three people can keep a secret if two of them are dead.
Yes, but there's a phase where only one of them was dead, right? And the conclusion of the movie hinges like indirectly a little bit on, we don't hear anything from Satoshi anymore because they're both not with us anymore, right?
Yeah,
That's kind of,
I think that it's very convenient to assign agency to Len and Hal because they are each safely dead. And that makes it really easy to assign things over there, and you can either drag evidence in or push evidence away, and there's no good way to debate it.
the
Um,
other thing is um
it's
like
also
Satoshi,
highly,
like also this separation between the two people, right? Conflicts a little bit if you other people did that and I did that on my own and came to conclusions that agree with at least most of the serious studies on it. It seems like the main homestead of Satoshi Nakamoto was in or near the Eastern time zone. If I mean Pacific time zone, so essentially HALS would have required that he would typically post in the early morning hours. Now, I know that you can forge it and cypherpunks do that, pretending a different time zone and so on, But there's some times when you have immediate reactions by Satoshi Nakamoto. So somebody popped up like an alert or something, and he was pretty much, there a few minutes later, right? And that would be quite unusual. Or that you put up a code update, right? And of course, you can do it differently, but most people write the code and then submit it, right?
well, this is all evidence that, to me, this supports my opinion. I'm not even going to dignify it with the word hypothesis, because it's like I think that there is still a real mystery there, and I think that that is evidence that supports there had to be somebody else.
Yeah. But for that, right? If you look at Satoshi Nakamoto, my kind of maybe contrary to what is commonly said, Satoshi Nakamoto, at least acting in his role, right, was much less of a fanatic cypherpunk, right? Actually, he never used the word cypherpunk. Of course, that can be all part of the deceit, right? As everything you can say, if you find a contradiction, whatever, like he like Hal didn't code in C++, plus plus, you can always say, yeah, he did that to conceal that he's usually a C coder. But that's less likely when you do something that's very challenging, right? Then you usually, like, for example, if you write a book, you don't write it in a new language you just learned and come out of the classroom, right? But let's say you learn Chinese or so, and then you want to make a fundamental paper in science or so, you would not choose to do that in something you just learned and which would not have been your main expertise, right? But of course, all that can be resolved. Maybe he was secretly taking C++ lessons or doing that as a secret hobby or so. But if it all comes together, it's unlikely that in all these contradictions are resolved by that, right? And the other thing is Satoshi, as I said, most of the conversations were not into cypherpunk topics, not into whatever saving the world. Most of the Satoshi stuff was really technical stuff on the code. How do I improve the code? That's pretty much 90% and almost 100% of all the conversations he ever had. He was all about pulling off these things, which he did himself or with the group, whichever hypothesis you kind of support, right? But then it was all like, okay, that thing is running. We have to fix some bugs. Let's keep the community small. So the whole thing shouldn't get a huge impact initially because it's essentially beta tested while it's already out, right? You couldn't relaunch it or so without making having a fatal impact on the whole story and the future of Bitcoin. And
When
so,
you say things like that, to me, that sounds like it is evidence consistent with my belief that there is at least one unknown person.
yeah. But then, how, like, I mean, you know much more than me about it. Let's forget about Bitcoin. Let's say you have a project that, like an open source project, as many of these things were, right? And you were, it, and you're the coder, but you want the community to help you on fixing bugs, on finding, let's say, vulnerabilities and so on against attacks and so on. It would be hard to see that somebody who writes the code would tell somebody else who is part of the team but not involved in the coding to make all these very technical statements. I mean, in fairness, I had to look up, like, I mean, I know a little bit coding, but I'm far away from crypto coding and internet coding and so on. I'm not really an expert on that, right? And there was so much technical content that at multiple emails I read from Satoshi, that was really like deep stuff, at least for me, right? Maybe for you guys it would be your daily bread or so, but it was definitely, but I couldn't see that somebody who would have found all these, let's say, bugs or improvements of the code or something like that, changing some library or something like that, that he would not directly have posted these comments, right? And the other thing is he, again, that can be all part of the fake or the construct, but it never slipped him that he was working with others. For example, I mean, one thing is it's still hard to believe, at least for me, that he only self-tested Bitcoin. But he said that. Now it can be some, of course, it can be part of the disguise, but it never slipped him the word we. I mean, in the Bitcoin white paper, it's part of authors we, and that's how we write papers. Even if I write a paper by myself, I say in the scientific way we, right? So that's not really like it was a team, at least not as a single evidence. But otherwise, it never slipped him that there was another member of the group. And of course, that can be a very diligent OPSEC, right? But it was so consistent, and we're talking about essentially from August 2008 when he first reached out before the white paper to the very last email end of April 2011. It never really slipped that there was somebody else involved. So either that was perfect OPSEC, which is of course possible, right? Or
It doesn't have to
it
be
was really
perfect, it
only
only
him.
has to be good enough. And it only has to be good enough. And and I mean, again, when you say these things to me, this is supporting evidence for there being more than one person. that's how I interpret what you're saying, is that it's like, ah, we really agree on most of this.
Sure. And you think like there is, on the other hand, let's say it wouldn't, I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto, I mean, I talked to a few people when I ran my analysis of all these blockchain transactions to several people who know more about it. And I just told them, look, just tear it apart, if you find the flaw in it. And actually, none of them was not convinced that there's a lot of truth to my analysis. And
Oh, you have very good analysis. You really do.
thank you for that. But you know, I mean, it's good if you have people who don't automatically trust you to be
Hmm.
like an advocatus diaboli kind of in terms of telling the truth, right? And that's my
Right.
main ambition. Not necessarily find the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. I think it will always, like, given that we have pretty much all the pool of evidence assembled, and unless an undisclosed, so far undisclosed eyewitness kind of steps out, or Satoshi Nakamoto kind of voluntarily comes out, we just don't know the mystery. And for me, it's kind of fine, right? But the point is essentially, right? We have like we will not find the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto, even if he's still alive,
Hmm.
unless he steps forward. There's no, I mean, you mentioned the cryptographic proof. Yeah, that's what we are all crying for, right? But Satoshi is probably not interested, right? He's probably fine. He might do something else and that he enjoys and just
If I
distance
if
himself from the whole thing, as many very ingenious people do, right? You have Nobel laureates who, or you just mentioned somebody like Merkel, Ralph Merkel, who was also cited in the white paper, right? Some of these people just stop in the field because they think they have done everything that is exciting to their own entertainment,
they get bored
and
and they
they
leave.
open a new chapter, right?
Yeah.
So Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that is, might not run around here every day. Oh, here I'm Satoshi Nakamoto and the Bitcoin. He might be fine in another world, or probably still in computing or something related, but he's not as eager to be Satoshi Nakamoto as a lot of people think, right?
Right.
And
This is also part of why I think I have the internal metaphor that is kind of like a rock band. The money comes in, you have all the money that you could possibly spend in the world. And you've gotten bored with this, and what do? You walk off. And I don't see why people don't believe that they would just do that. I mean, it's like lots of people make money at something and then they just walk away.
yeah, even though he didn't make the money, or at least not as much as he could have, And what I was to ask you, actually, that was a long introduction, is um, so the person who was Satoshi Nakamoto, on the one hand, wasn't at least trying to propagate a cypherpunk agenda through the issuance of Bitcoin. That might have been part of his OPSEC, right? But he was cypherpunk enough to not turn it into a profitable financial investment. And of course, now people say like, yeah, that's kind of goodwill or something like that. But I mean, he could have. I mean, like nobody could have blamed him to say, look, I just cash in, I just go to the exchanges and cash out, maybe not all of it, but a few million, that wouldn't even have hurt the market, and I would buy me a nice house in Santa Monica or something like that.
I
So
I think
so
that also there is a thing here, which is that the Satoshi team wanted to remain mostly unknown. And I also think that there were personality reasons why people would want to do that. And for people who are doing it, that if you are doing a thing where you have a persona, and that is the mask that you are wearing every time you open your mouth, there's a chance that you'll slip. There's a chance that you'll make some little mistake. You don't turn on the VPN to hide your IP address correctly. Whatever it is that you're doing, you slip up. I mean, there's a brouhaha on Twitter right now where apparently people have saved away things where apparently Elon Musk was pretending to be both his mother and his father on Twitter. And I don't want to get into it. It's just, but because that is the only relevance is that if you are doing something where you are presenting this thing that that and part of it is that you don't want to be found every time that you speak into the Satoshi microphone is a chance that someone will figure out who you are. And there comes a point when you just say, fine, I'm done now. I don't want to be outed. Um, I've done lots of work on this. I'm really tired of fixing bugs. Every developer gets to the I'm tired of fixing bugs state. And they have enough bitcoins in a thing, and they also have their own little mining rig going on where they're generating enough money that it's all going. And it's like, fine, I'm done here.
Yeah, but the problem is like, I mean, sorry for being always jumping in there, but like I just studied it so tightly, right? I mean, the problem is already in 2010, mining Bitcoin was not trivial, right? I mean, it was trivial in 2009, where Satoshi was more or less the only, at least, continuous miner, and he had to do it because otherwise the blockchain would not have worked by its very principles, right? You needed somebody who generates a new block every 10 minutes, roughly. So in 2010, there are reports that people made a huge effort, mostly out of fun, not really to get rich at the time, just to say, oh yeah, I want to mine some. And you have reports where people had major mining rigs and didn't get a single Bitcoin, right? So, or a single Coinbase reward, which was 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes at the time, right? So it wasn't so easy after, let's say, the second half of 2010 to really mine Bitcoin. It wasn't just like, I mean, CPU, you have like your whatever average PC, and you just install the mining code there on your thing, and then the BTC would trickle in. That didn't happen anymore, right?
I
It
know,
was still possible, but it was like, I mean,
but
GPU mining came in, so
this is
it's not
also
like,
the era where people were paying for their degrees.
yeah, because you could buy Bitcoin. Right? Like people bought thousands of Bitcoin, I think, for something like ridiculous dollar amounts, and were even on.
I considered in in roughly that era to put like $1,000 into Bitcoin, and I didn't because it was just too much trouble.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
there
it was
were these discussions on various fora, like the Bitcoin forum or so, where people said, "Oh, it's so cumbersome to mine Bitcoin. Why do it? Because it's much cheaper to buy it just off these exchanges that started flourishing and these days, with Mt. Gox and this kind of stuff.
I think
Bitcoin wasn't costing a
you're
fortune.
putting too much value into loose talk on the internet.
No, no, that's documented on the Bitcoin forum. There or other
It's loose
forums.
talk on the internet. I mean, there were people at that era. I mean, it's sort of like I knew like a dozen people who were mining their own Bitcoins. And I didn't because I didn't feel like it. But I mean, really, there were people, lots of people were making Bitcoins. And I mean, I knew people who would say, people are talking about how difficult it is to do it, and not only do I think they're stupid, but it makes it easier for me because I'm mining Bitcoin. It's like I want people to think it's hard to mine Bitcoin
No, I mean you
because
could
I
see
don't
the
want to let them into
prices
my
on the
free money
exchanges,
thing.
right? The prices on the exchanges we can track back, right? Like how much it was. Like you have the prices, whatever at Mount Gox at various months. essentially still documented on the internet. And essentially, Bitcoin didn't cost a fortune in the early days, let's say after Satoshi Nakamoto's
And
departure.
even in some of the other days, I had people who were saying, "Oh, you ought to do it." It's like you can go over to AliExpress and order this, that, the other thing, and you can set it up in there. And it's like, yeah, and yeah, it's like building your own. It's like building your own Linux PC.
Yeah, I mean, like, in let's say, look, I look at it from a mostly layman perspective, but I think not a lot of people would have been skilled enough to get into GPU mining on their own, right, with own code and so on. For that, you would have to, on the one hand, invest in a couple of GPUs and know how to program them and so on, because you were only an advantage
Well,
before, like
you only need to know how to program them until someone has written the code. And then, you dot slash configure, make install.
yeah, after the software is already out,
Yeah.
but not before the software is out, right? Like I remember that in the early days of Linux, I was in there in the early 90s. I had to write my own display drivers, right? And nowadays, no, like even for Linux, or well, for a long time now, you essentially got that all with an installation where you just click install, right? I mean, that's a difference. Yeah, but I mean, like, so the person, this kind of third or fourth person, like the two plus person that you mentioned, he would have, he's statistically probably still alive because the people who die early are, well, unfortunately, the case here in this tandem is not the usual case, right? Most people, let's say, that are now in their 60s or 50s or 60s are fortunately still alive, right? So statistically, you would assume that somebody who was involved would still be alive these days and was alive after the death of these two people. So this person would have been enough cypherpunk kind of to maintain and secure the origin myth. So like the who is Satoshi Nakamoto essentially, and also the some people say the virgin birth, that essentially the miner who had um, a competitive advantage because there was no or practically not really any serious competition in 2009, and who shoved in all these Bitcoin, like 1 million Bitcoin at least, um, uh, somehow was probably a I don't know, he wanted like a equal playing field thing or something, and said it was unfair to get them, or he just never spent them to not disclose his anonymity or
I think they
pseudonymity.
lost the keys.
Well, that doesn't seem to be the case because these keys, not all of them, but let's say I think it's about 100 or 200 of them, have been moving on in patterns that suggest that likely the person was even moving his final. I mean, it gets more diffuse as the years and the number of transactions progresses, right? But there are certain patterns like peeling patterns and bundling patterns and so on, which make it very likely that he was still acting on the blockchain and even took it to early exchanges and even to, I think, Kraken and some others, even in the years past, so, or at least up to Hal Finney's uh, death and also in the years after. I mean, the chances get lower and lower that was mixed with something else, maybe not by Satoshi anymore. But there are these evidences. But it's definitely beyond the death of Len Sassaman that there
Mhm.
were very, very likely transactions by Satoshi Nakamoto. And Len Sassaman's death was essentially almost coincidental with the departure of
And the,
Satoshi Nakamoto from the scene.
and this kind of this, this tracking, the tracking ability is why when Len would have hated it and did, because it's it's a fully tracked system.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
anonymous.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So, Yeah, that's at least my angle, right? And that's why I'm skeptical. The other approach I didn't like with the movie, and especially as you pointed out how good an investigator the person is, from a scientific point of view, it had an outcome bias, right? So initially confined without proper justification, that essentially it could only be a pool of five, six people. So the usual suspects like Adam Back, Hal Finney, Nick Szabo, Wei Dai, um, uh, um, um, and I think yeah, and Sassaman, and yeah, pretty much he said,
Well,
okay, we start with
again,
the
the movie has
hypothesis.
to fit in an hour and a half. They can only put an hour and a half of stuff in there. And there are many, many, many hours. There there's hundreds of hours of what they did, and they have to distill it down to fit in a time. They also have to tell a story that is interesting enough that 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 people will want to watch it, because ultimately the reason that you make a film is because you want people to watch it. So the filmmakers have to tell a story in a way that does it. And to me, because we're all coming this from different points of view, so it's kind of like Rashomon. And from me, I look at it, and from my viewpoint, I like the movie because it does not come to an Agatha Christie ending, and because it paints a picture that I see the point of, but even in those of us who are in the core of the discussions that were part of the movie going on, was that we all have our own different points of view.
Yeah, but again, you are completely right that I'm criticizing the movie not as a movie, but as an investigative effort, right? And that's unfair. So you're completely right. A movie I would make, nobody would watch because I go into so many tangents, even in this discussion, we are kind of a little bit bouncing from here to there, and that would confuse a typical audience. So I would be completely unsuited to script such a movie. And I fully get what you're saying. But still, in the community, so in those who are really interested in it, um, the kind of approach of starting with a unjustified confinement, which of course a normal audience doesn't care about, right? And then starting with statements like Satoshi Nakamoto never moved any coins, that was even in the trailer, right? Is simply false. So as a movie, I understand, I
It's
fully
it's a
agree that it's
simplification.
entertaining and comes to a nice ending, even though the ending is kind of weird because I think it was a little bit unfair to Fran, so the wife of Finney, right, who amended essentially a statement which was just displayed as a text message when everybody essentially already goes to the loo or so, and essentially says that she doesn't think that Hal didn't wouldn't have revealed to her that he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and maybe that's an understandable, maybe also self-protection, that he didn't have these Bitcoin fortunes that Satoshi Nakamoto would have held,
And you see,
But
to
okay, I
me,
mean that might be for different reasons. We might not want to get too deep into because there were some unfortunate things that happened to her when rumors came around, So that might be just maybe we
well,
just leave it
I
there,
think
But
I think that the New York Times article was irresponsible because of the way that it fingered Adam, and he was shocked by this to the point that he immediately went to the Guardian to deny it, which is, it's in some respects hilarious that he goes from, one major newspaper says Adam is Satoshi, and Adam goes to another major newspaper to say, no, I'm not.
yeah, but I'm not proposing that you should always dox Adam back, but I mean, scientifically, he would be a credible candidate, right? I mean,
So
there's some
I do not,
soft
I
regions
do
that he's
not think
not.
that Adam has the personality that could permit him to remain anonymous. Adam would want to take credit for it. Adam does not have the personality to be the person in the shadows. Adam wants to be in the spotlight. Adam wanted to be in the shadows.
Yeah, yeah, let's say for me, Adam Back would have all the technical skills and the cypherpunk spirit to, in principle, would have been able to pull off Bitcoin
I
in
have to smile every
2008.
time you say
Yeah,
cypherpunk spirit.
yeah. But but I don't think he was it for a couple of soft reasons, which would take a long time. It's all probabilistic. But if you have a couple of unlikely things that would have to come together, it almost becomes a certainty that he's not. And that's not because of its skills and all that. But again, that's
Well,
that's a different
I
topic. But
I
it's
think,
I've
yeah, I think that after all of these years, the one thing that seems most likely is that none of the usual suspects are Satoshi, whatever our Satoshi means.
yeah,
And
that's
that
that's
and that
exactly my
this is
conclusion.
why,
Yeah.
in fact, it's like I said to Tyler, I would joked and said, Satoshi is, part of Satoshi is an extropian to be named later. And while I fingered all the extropians, that was only because it was a group of people that I knew indirectly. I was not part of it, but I certainly knew of them, read some of their things. I knew that Hal was involved. I knew that lots of other people were, and it was a group of people that were outside of the light. It's like everybody continually is looking for the lost keys under the streetlight. And they go back over each pebble under the streetlight and they examine the pebble really close and they put their eye up to the little pebble. And it's like there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that we don't know. And as a matter of fact, the things that we don't know are much bigger than the things that we do know. So whoever the missing person or persons are out there and they have managed to slip away and are safely living in Dubai, Lisbon, Singapore, Amsterdam, who knows? But
Yeah,
they're
well,
off.
they might have a company. They might have done something else that would have been great. And an interesting thing would be probably if you're Satoshi Nakamoto, it's impossible. I don't think he follows whatever on an hourly basis the current exchange rate or something like that. But you cannot. I mean, it is a mainstream media news now, right? Like the value of Bitcoin is shown on many tickers and so on, and sometimes comes into the news for the good or for the bad. New record high, new crypto winter or something like that. So he's certainly he's probably not living in a cave, right? So he's probably on the internet, and once in a while he gets even asked about Bitcoin, right? Maybe a friend of him or so asks him like, "Do you recommend that I buy Bitcoin?" Or it just comes up in a pop when you talk to people or strangers at a business meeting or so, more like as a whatever, like a little bit conversation off the topic just to loosen up the mood and so on. And I would be interested to see his face when he
So
would be asked, should I, or somebody gives a monologue on how Bitcoin is bad or good or something like that, his reaction, I would really be,
today, I would dare say that Bitcoin is a really bad investment. And and a few years ago, a thing that people had noted, and this was one of the people say snarky things all of the time, and also they cherry pick evidence. But cherry picked evidence can often be an illustration of a direction to go. And and if you had bought Netflix stock um, when Netflix first went public and you'd held on to it until like 2020 or so, You would have made more money by putting your money in Netflix than you would have in Bitcoin.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are
And
other good investments other than Bitcoin. Whether it's a good or bad investment, I leave uncommented.
yeah, I mean,
That's not my
um,
my.
um, a number of years ago, I don't remember how many, handful of them, PayPal did this thing where they sent me an email and they said, "Oh, if you go and you buy $25 of Bitcoin, we'll give you $25." And I laughed and I said, "So basically you're giving, you're giving me free $25 worth of Bitcoin." And then they did another one a few months later where it was, if you put $10 in, we'll give you $10. And for everybody that you recommend, we'll give you another $10 more. So I convinced one friend to buy $10 worth of cryptocurrency on PayPal. So I had $45 worth of cryptocurrency and I just looked on my app. It's worth $51.54. I have made $6 in 5 years.
Yeah, which is like more than 10%. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's debatable for whom and whether at all
My
Bitcoin is a good
leftover Apple
investment.
stock has made a lot more in terms
Yeah.
of percentages than that.
Yeah. Look, I mean, but let me ask you, like, I mean, let's pretend you were Satoshi or just play that role, right?
Mhm.
And then there would be like a person you wouldn't even know who comes up to you and asks and it tells you, look, I wrote a long book and whatever, like spend a lot of time on this research, right? And I found that you tick pretty much all the boxes or most of the boxes of being the creator of Bitcoin, right? And let's say you were not one of the usual suspects because they all got fed up and probably cannot stand anymore. Like Adam Back probably cannot hear like another journalist approaching him and asking him whether he's Satoshi. But let's say it's somebody out there who would have not been at the spotlight. And let's pretend you are playing that role now. How would you react? Like you get an email by your Satoshi, you kind of distance yourself, and kind of now somebody comes up like a person like myself you wouldn't even know and kind of put to your desk this request. Would you delete the email? Would you say no, it's not me? Would you reason why it's not you? Or what, how would you react? As let's put yourself into the possible mindset of a nowadays Satoshi Nakamoto. What would be the most
Is this
clever move
is
and
this a
what?
trick question? Are you trying to prove that I'm Satoshi?
I don't have much evidence. I mean, I know you were a great guy in the scene and are probably still, but you just don't tick my search criteria, right? So I could, I'm pretty sure you probably know Satoshi Nakamoto, but not as Satoshi Nakamoto,
Yeah,
right?
that's what
Like
I think.
if I told you my top candidate, which people find in my book and which my inner circle kind of confirmed to me, I'm pretty sure you would have an idea who that was and would probably say, "Oh, I never thought about him. I don't know
Yeah,
enough about him." And then if you read that section in my book, you'd probably say, "Wow, you got a pretty good hit," right? So, but it's not somebody that was ever like circulated as Satoshi Nakamoto in the mainstream media or even on these forums on X or mailing list or whatever, right? So if you were that person, and again, I don't think it's you unless you would tell me now, not because you were not skilled enough or so, but you just the path of you was not really complying with what my theoretical picture of Satoshi Nakamoto would be, but not because you didn't have the technical skills, but for other reasons, you know. But
well,
if
I don't have, I mean, I think proof of work is an incredibly stupid idea and always have.
yeah, but like how would you react? Just like what would be a
I'd
smart
delete
move
the
for
email.
somebody coming from the
Yeah,
online privacy scene and so on?
because whoever Satoshi is probably asked about it between one and two handful times a year. And it's
No, I
been
don't
10
know.
years
Well, maybe,
or
maybe
more.
not. I don't think my candidate, my top favorite, and I don't know whether he's Satoshi because it's impossible to know unless he comes out. But if you were approached, out of the blue as Satoshi Nakamoto, like what would be the cleverest reaction to a journalist or myself? I'm not a journalist, actually. Um, you know, reacting to that? Would you just delete the email or would you
Yeah,
say no? Or
yeah. I delete the email.
yeah, that's what I think. So anybody who would react overly to it kind of is already excluded kind of from the inner circle of my candidates, because
Yeah.
it wouldn't be smart. You said it before, right? Every time you essentially speak into a microphone, either with typing or with, the danger of revealing something accidentally or so is too high. So the smartest move is just to ignore it. And I think he gets away with it because the only real proof, I mean, whatever you find, right? I mean, unless you break into his computer and find all the Satoshi keys, which would of course be illegal and not really, there's no legal means to get hold of that. You're fine, right? Because you can find out whatever you want. Eventual truth against your will that you are or that you get
Take the
uncovered
take the
against your
the
will
the
is probably
meta
zero.
take the metaphor slash meme of, the person who walks away from the explosion. The protagonist of the story walks away in the final bits of the movie, and the house blows up behind them. All of the Satoshi keys are in the house being blown up.
You mean
If
literally or
you are
metaphorically?
Satoshi and you want to walk away from it, you delete the keys.
Yeah, but he might have done that by now, but he didn't do that most likely until the mid 2000s, right? So it was definitely not something that was coinciding with his departure from Bitcoin, because we know that that is not the case
Well,
from the
well,
blockchain analysis, which I take probably the hardest proof. If you have any hardest proof, that's probably the
well,
best you
well,
can have.
blockchain transactions are facts. The
Well, yeah,
interpretations
but we
of
don't have a name tag, right? So the analysis of the mining of Satoshi is all based on plausibility and some algorithms that you would have applied to mine new Bitcoin. So that's pretty much the hardest proof we have. I don't and
who amongst
rationally
us does
he
not
needed
have
to
a
mine these
server in the
coins in order
closet?
to sustain the blockchain,
I mean,
right? So
who amongst us does not have a server in the closet? I mean, I think that Satoshi walked off the scene at the point that it became mainstream. And it is a cultural thing. Like, you talk about, cypherpunkness, and I always get a wry smile when you do, because, cypherpunkness is kind of like punk rock. No two people will agree on what it means to be punk rock, and no two cypherpunks will agree on what it means to be a cypherpunk. And because it was a mailing list, it was a social scene as much as anything else.
yeah, but there
You
were
know,
common let's say online privacy was definitely a common denominator, right,
yeah.
for cypherpunks, that was an important thing to get out on the internet. I mean, you were part of that, and would you have had any people? Of course, there was no official membership or an official registered
Like,
club or something like that. But I think online privacy in a wider sense, and that should have some
I'm,
impact on societies, was pretty much a common ground for
one
this.
one of the things that was the slogan was cypherpunks write code. And the person who said that was not a coder.
Yeah, that's
And
that's the
and and
irony.
and and I view it as like other things that came out of other communities of people off on the margins. It's like the in the 1960s, Abby Hoffman said, "Don't trust anyone over 30." And part of the joke was that he had turned 30 like a month before. And so when he said don't trust anybody over 30, he's being wry, and he's also saying, why the hell do you think that I'm the one who gets to say things definitively? And at the time with things, because I had been doing a bunch of cryptographic coding and the like, my joke was I'm too busy coding to be a cypherpunk. Because the cypherpunks mailing list frequently had 100 to 200 messages a day. It's like there were lots of times when I said, you have to spend like 3 hours a day just reading the mailing list. And so my joke was, I can't be I'm not really a cypherpunk because I'm too busy coding to keep up with what's going on the list. Um, and lots of people had lots of different opinions about things. And really the dot-com bust had as part of its fallout that the original cypherpunks list basically fell apart, and then after a little while there was a new cypherpunks list. And it's
Yeah, it
kind of
wasn't
like,
called cypherpunk, so that was essentially the cryptography mailing list there, on which.
the cryptography mail Perry created the cryptography mailing list because it wasn't cypherpunk's mailing list. It was intended to be sort of like, we talk about cryptography, we don't talk politics. Yes, I know cryptography is intimately involved in power and so on, and therefore you can't just have a blanket ban on it. But we're here to talk about cryptography, and that's kind of the rule today. It's like as moderator just last week, there was somebody coming up with a new consensus system, and I looked at what they were doing, and it was like, yeah, okay, fine. There's real cryptographic content in here. It's not just political ramblings, except,
Yeah, but on the other hand, I interviewed also some, let's say, academic cryptographers, right? And most of them, some of them were, but most of them wouldn't have come down to the cryptography. I'm talking about these, academics who publish at, the best, highest top journals and so on. They would have rarely been regulars on. I
well,
mean, some were because we have some evidence. I mean, even some
no, they
appear
weren't,
with their
because
real names,
because
but it wasn't a common thing that all the typical exchange medium amongst academic
well,
cryptographers, right?
academic academic cryptographers are mathematicians.
Yeah. And
And
Satoshi
anyone,
was kind of not so much. If you read the white paper, and academic
mm,
mathematician would have written the mathematical part slightly differently.
it's plainly obvious that whoever wrote that paper was not an academic.
Yeah, or maybe like a very early kind of academic who still needs to get a foot on the ground in that very established
or
team.
or somebody who's saying, thank God I don't have to follow AMS style.
Yeah, I
I don't
mean,
have to use this style sheet and blah 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 for it's like, God, editing the latex sometimes on academic papers.
yeah, but I guess the white paper wouldn't have been, like most people learn LaTeX for a week or so, and then they could have already written the what it took to write the white paper. Even though the white paper being written in open office was probably um, a red herring, I think, like because if you can write a C++ code of Bitcoin, it would have been easy for you if you had already been slightly familiar with Bitcoin to kind of do LaTeX. That's one of the explanations I would actually like to ask Satoshi Nakamoto. I have a list of questions where I said, Satoshi Nakamoto, please don't tell me who you are. It's kind of fine that you're anonymous, but for curiosity, I would have a list of, let's say, 10 main questions where, and one of them would be, why did you take open office of that? Look, John, maybe it's time to come to a conclusion, right? So, shall we quickly, if we get back to the
Yeah.
finding
I mean,
Satoshi,
I think I really like the movie. I really do. I think it's a
yeah,
great movie. I
exactly,
think it
as a movie,
I think it
but
is a and I agree with other people who were involved saying it would be really cool if like at least 10 hours of stuff was also released.
Maybe they should
because
release that on the
they have
internet
to
or
compress
something,
it
you know?
down.
Yeah,
And 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 a summary includes that those of us who were friends and colleagues of Hal and Len still have our own opinions, which are overlapping, but we all have the I really believe this. I have, there's a halo that goes out from what you really think is so to what you think is that sounds plausible, that sounds possible. And there's a lot of overlap amongst us. But we also have an awful lot of disagreements. And those include that I think that Len was not very involved, if at all. I am willing to believe that Len was involved early on, but I also know that he wouldn't have been involved, and an awful lot of it includes things like what's somebody's personality like.
yeah,
A
that
bunch of
would,
the analysis
uh,
does not take into account that there are human beings involved and that human beings do the things that they do for their own reasons that often they don't even really understand themselves.
yeah,
Um, and Hal was certainly not Satoshi, but the way that I phrase it is that Hal played bass in the band. He laid down the beats. He provided structure to a whole bunch of stuff, but no, he wasn't Satoshi. And I think that there is at least one, maybe two other people, probably not three, because again, it's like how many people are going to be involved before somebody's going to leak or somebody's going to make a mistake.
yeah.
But it's
Maybe
really,
we,
really, really important to understand that Bitcoin happened as part of a scene, and that scene was cultural as much as anything else, and that the way that people looked at it at the time is not the way that people look at it now. And part of the reason why I don't pay a lot of attention to it anymore is precisely those people weren't there. I was there. I think that I think that they're assigning meaning in the wrong places. It really was kids having fun. A lot of it really was a whole bunch of people screwing around with interesting ideas and so on and so forth. And it wasn't like people trying to build what Bitcoin was doing. It was, I got a cool idea. I went out and I bought a guitar and an amp, and I'm practicing and I'm going to play, and we ought to just get up and play together. And that many of these people didn't know each other except through handles was common. There's all sorts of people that I only know by their handle. I have no idea how to get in touch with them ever again.
yeah. It's also interesting that except for Adam Back, essentially a lot of these people you saw in the 1990s and 2000 are pretty much absent
Mhm.
from the hardcore Bitcoin movement. I mean, Adam Back is their front, every little event
Oh,
which has the name Bitcoin in it. He's kind of
yeah,
like
but
a keynote
Adam formed a
speaker,
company.
but
Adam
everybody
started a
else,
business.
right, is not sure. Maybe some own Bitcoin and some might hate it and like yourself and or discouraged from using it. But nobody's really in the front line saying, "Look, I was there, and I kind of promote Bitcoin." Or so. It's strange that yeah, except for back, pretty much nobody is highly visible as a promoter and or even as a uh, discouraging people from believing in the story. That's also
And
something
I
I
think that
find
an
quite
awful lot
interesting.
of it is that if you were involved in the early days at the time, you would be disgusted at the current commercialism. You would say the movement sold out. And it would be the way that people who were in myriad punk rock bands in the late 70s and 80s would have said punk rock got commercialized, it got sucked up by the conglomerates, it all sold out. I'm happy for my friends who got successful, but the movement died.
Mm.
And it's all a bunch of suits, and it's all a bunch of people like that. That the reason why people walked away, you can find in the Pink Floyd song "Have a Cigar." It's the same disillusionment.
Yeah, we surely share our love for Pink Floyd. Um, okay, let's leave it there. And I thank you very much, John, for kind of putting a little bit of nuances on a nice movie production and raising that there was hours and hours and hours of interviews, which of course couldn't fit into the scope and the theme and the whole also commercial purpose of a movie that should not attract like nerds like myself, but that is meant for broader audiences. So that makes it very understandable. Thanks so much, John.
Yeah,
Appreciate that you
it's
came
always
back.
great talking to you.
Thanks so much. Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye.